Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our seminar this morning. On behalf of the Counselors of Real Estate, welcome to our presentation of The Algorithm Owns the Block, AI's Role in Real Estate Investing. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I'm Steve Norris, CRE Principal of Norris Realty Advisors in Pasadena, California, and the 2026 Second Vice Chair of the Counselors of Real Estate. The Counselors of Real Estate is a global organization of commercial property advisors and has long been a beacon of thought leadership and problem solving in our industry. The organization's strength lies in the diversity of expertise and experience amongst our distinguished members, myself accepted, of course, those who have earned the prestigious CRE designation. Please visit simply cre.org to review our membership criteria and to determine whether you too might be interested in joining our organization, and where you may also subscribe to our peer-reviewed journal, Real Estate Issues. It's free and it's the best thing out there, I promise you. I get a lot of stuff and this is the best. I always read it. You're encouraged to utilize the Q&A feature. Should you wish to submit a question, your participation is welcomed and we'll answer as many questions as time will allow for. I'd like to introduce now today's moderator, Lonnie Hendry, CRE, Chief Product Officer of TREP Incorporated, and co-host of the popular TrepWire podcast. Lonnie's role centers on leading product management teams to develop and commercialize innovative solutions for commercial real estate, CMBS, and collateralized loan obligation markets. Lonnie was invited to membership in the Counselors in 2022. Welcome, Lonnie.
Thank you, Stephen, and thanks to our panelists for taking the time here and for everyone in attendance. We're very excited that we get to talk about artificial intelligence and its impact on CRE investing today. This has definitely been in the headlines for some time now, and what we're hoping to do in this webinar is kind of demystify some of the headlines, kind of give some real-world practitioner experience of how people are actually leveraging this in the marketplace. And so whether you're a novice and maybe only interacted with some chat features of Chat GPT or OpenAI, or you're someone that's actually worked and built some AI tools, we're going to try to run the gamut here and give you some perspective across the spectrum. So I love doing these webinars. Every time CRE, the counselors ask me to participate, I try to clear my calendar and participate because I think it's a great way for us to just talk to some of the brightest people in the marketplace. So today's no exception. I have three great panelists on the panel. So without any further ado, I'm going to have them do a quick introduction, starting with Ryan, then we'll go to Julia and then Patrick. Give us a 30-second highlight reel of what you do and who you are, and then we'll get into the substance.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ryan Severino. I'm the Chief Economist and Head of Research at BGO. Just for the record, I am not sponsored by the Patagonia clothing company, although I'm clearly rocking their vest on the program today. I have been doing real estate economics and research for longer than some people in this industry have been alive. I think the reason I'm on the panel today is that I've spent the majority of my career trained as a traditional economist, mathematics, econometrics, economic theory. And maybe a decade or so ago, I could see the writing on the wall and realized where the world was going in terms of data science, compute power, number crunching. And I thought, I don't know enough about it. I started teaching myself that. And then I thought, I need to know more. And so I joined the organization that I think I'm biased, but has the best data science team in the industry. And so I have learned an incredible amount over the last 3 years. And I try to bridge that gap between the old world traditional econometrics and the new world of data science and forecasting. And that's the perspective that I hope to bring to the panel today. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you for having me. I'm Julia Georgioulis. I lead research for JLL globally across our capital markets and our leasing advisory business lines, which means I'm working kind of dual brain across both occupiers and investors. I'm based in Boston. I've been with JLL for 20 years now, so I'm really homegrown in the industry over that period of time. And it's been fun to see the evolution, always in research and always thinking about data and how do we use it for the betterment of our industry.
Thanks, Julia. So I'm Patrick Nessenthaler. I'm the founder and CEO of Crinetics. I'm also a counselor, and I'd like to state on the record that I beat Lonnie to the punch where I got my CRE in 2021. So I do got one leg up on you, Lonnie. So I do a variety of different things. I've been in the business for about 20 plus years, both on the valuation side as well as the capital markets. We founded Crinetics. It was born out of really 2 years of applied research at Rutgers University with two of the world's largest data providers, including our great friends over at TREP. And we combine the space market and the transaction market and effectively provide predictive intelligence across the commercial real estate ecosystem, mostly at the enterprise level. Our team is actually really built outside the real estate ecosystem, meaning that we're kind of combining myself as a real estate professional with folks in the data science, IT, statistician world, and we're bringing folks in from Oracle as well as a geospatial engineer from a publicly funded space agency. So we got a lot of folks that are outside kind of the real estate ecosystem, but we kind of like to be the epitome of where we think real estate technology is going, of just kind of merging the two fields. So excited to be here and excited to participate.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate you guys taking time to do an introduction. So we'll just jump right in. It's really interesting, Patrick, as you mentioned there, having some people with expertise outside of traditional real estate. But I think technology has allowed and almost required that to be part of the process at this point. And AI has really allowed us to bring in disparate anecdotal data into the real estate workflow. And so maybe as we kick this off, the first question I'd like to ask, and we'll start off with Ryan, maybe go in the same order we did as the intros, is, there's been a lot of hype around AI. We're not real sure exactly what's real and what's not if you're just someone that's on the periphery. But when you hear AI in real estate, what is the first kind of real world use case that comes to mind that digs beneath the hype and actually get to where people are actually using the technology?
Yeah, I'll bring it to my perspective and what we do. Like, we have really utilized it to produce what I don't think I'm being hyperbolic when I say this, but the most accurate forecasting I think that has ever existed. And part of the issue with real estate for the longest time, I think, as everyone on this call knows, was we've always had issues with the data, right? It's a private, inefficient asset class. But what we've realized in the advent of basically like data centers, supercomputers, massive amounts of data, and all of this incredible compute power, is that if you bring enough of that to bear, even on a part of the economy that's inefficient as real estate is, it's actually incredible. The expression I use is that it sounds like science fiction, but it's really just science. And so from our perspective at BGO, we find it incredibly useful and powerful as a forecasting tool, the ability to forecast markets and rank markets. I think there's this notion in real estate that it's not a very forecastable asset class, and I think increasingly we're finding out that we can disabuse that notion because of how powerful all of this really is. And so that's probably our primary use case when I think about just how powerful artificial intelligence and machine learning really is in 2026.
Yeah, I would agree. We've been laser focused over the duration of my career and what I'll call like research DJing. We want to do mashups of real estate data with adjacent data and even underlying macroeconomic or drivers that you wouldn't necessarily point to and say that that's something that we're going to put into our forecast or that we're going to put alongside a real estate data set. And we started that journey with visual analytics. So really mapping as much data as you could to really show the full picture of a real estate market or an investment opportunity. And with AI now, we can mash up more of that data and look at data in a more real-time manner than you would have historically. I mean, for everybody who's been in real estate on this call, we have anchored to quarterly or annual reporting cycles. And now you can organize data in a much faster fashion, which gives us more of a real-time glimpse into the market, which I think is exciting.
So I'll echo what Ryan and Julie are saying, and maybe dive a little bit deeper into kind of secret sauce that we're doing at Crinetics without getting into the secret sauce. And I always like to kind of point out this article that was written by McKinsey back in November of 2018, which is really kind of the catalyst of how I got into the applied research, was to kind of establish this proof of concept. And when you think about, traditional, transaction indicators and, space market indicators, right? We think about those transactions as, contract rents and sale prices and absorption and things like that, things that we've always kind of empirically measured. But when you think about that from a statistical standpoint, the goodness of fit and the R squared are really 20% or less is kind of what we discovered in that applied research. But when we, again, going back to the McKinsey article, they kind of pointed out that 60% of the predictive power, what happens in real estate, actually happens in these like non-traditional space market indicators, right? So what's really compelling when you think about that, if you kind of flip it on its head, you mean to tell me that we've only looked at 40% of the predictive power in the history of our industry? And then my point, though, is when we start getting into the statistics, I mean, we definitely proved that is actually accurate. Of course, we didn't pay McKinsey to come in and help with the research because we didn't have a couple $1 million laying around. But when you start looking at some of these space market data points, you start looking at crime rates and key fob swabs at office building, elevator shaft movements, applications for pool permits, all these different data points that really provide predictive indicators of what's going to happen in the transaction market. So I'm not privy to what Ryan and Julia are looking at. Maybe they're looking at some of the same things, but we definitely see that AI and the ability to bring that type of compute power to analyze these type of data points at a statistical level, I think is the next generation of us in terms of predictive intelligence. So that's really what we're focused on at Crinetics.
Yeah, I think you guys all made some really great points. That's how I've seen it being utilized too. It feels like the first phase of AI was really just data extraction from documents. Like everyone was amazed when you could take an OM or a lease abstract and you could start pulling data out and you could start analyzing it. Now you can do that at scale across the web and across basically any data set at any size and any frequency. I mean, that's the reality. I think, like Julia said, taking things that used to be considered acceptable at a quarterly or semi-annual basis and now bringing those to the market on a day-by-day, week-by-week metric is just really, really fascinating. And what we know is it's not just the consumers or users of AI that are benefiting from this, but as you guys work with buyers, sellers, occupiers, et cetera, they're leveraging these tools too and becoming much more informed on the transaction side as well. So, Ryan, I wanted to go back to something you mentioned on like the forecasting component. Give me some examples, maybe some tangible examples of what you mean when you're saying forecasting. Are you looking at just stack ranking markets? Are you looking at actual like rent growth? Are you looking at, absorption levels? Like what would be some practical applications that AI has allowed you to kind of forecast real time?
It's sort of both. Like there is a rent growth vector that we're trying to forecast, although I think even with really sophisticated machine learning techniques, you don't need me to tell you this, but the economy is an incredibly like unpredictable, unstable environment. And so even with larger volumes of data and bigger models than human brains can reasonably comprehend, that can still be a challenging thing. But what we've found is that coming up with a rank order is actually much more stable over time. And so what we've really done is we've really built what is like an ensemble model, basically like a model of models, if you want to think about it that way, one of which is a model that predicts a rent growth vector. That is part of the process. I don't want to discount that. But what we're really concerned with is being able to differentiate, just to use the vernacular, winners from losers, right? What are the markets that would, rank order perform the best? Which are the ones that would perform the worst? And then how can we spend more time focused on the models that, or the markets that we think are going to outperform, avoid the markets that we think are going to underperform, and then utilize that both from an acquisitions perspective, but then on an ongoing basis, utilizing it from a portfolio management perspective, right? When's a good time to get out of deals? Let's not fall in love with them too much. Let's be a little more critical about our exit and not just overthink our entry into a lot of these things. And so that's where we've really found a lot of value in machine learning techniques. And again, the idea that you can build an ensemble and splice them together. The genesis of that, just sort of quick story, I don't know for people who remember, but maybe about a dozen or so years ago, Netflix was actually having difficulty with their recommendation algorithm. And so they crowdsourced it to a bunch of data science teams on the internet. And the model that won was an ensemble model, which is really a model of models. And the reason that tends to work better than individual models is individual models are really good at a particular thing, but really not good at other things. And once you start to synthesize and you bring different ways of thinking about data together, then you actually can end up in an environment where, you know, the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. And that's where we've really been focused on this. How do we rank markets around the world so that we can just make better investment decisions and better portfolio management decisions?
Yeah, I think that's great insight. And it kind of leads me to my next question, and I'll toss this one over to you, Julia. You know, where are you seeing AI in your workflow improving outcomes or efficiency? I mean, I think a lot of people are viewing AI as massive efficiency gain in their workforce. Obviously, it requires adoption, and we'll talk a little bit about adoption here in a little while and how do you can kind of maybe get better buy-in from your users. But where are you seeing efficiency gains or better outcomes using AI at your firm?
Yeah, I mean, we've spent a ton of time researching the dispersion of AI within the economy. We've thought about AI as an industry from a real estate user perspective. We're thinking about it as a business that needs to integrate AI into the workflows. We are looking at it, and we've done a lot of work to frame out the AI dispersion, as I mentioned. We're really looking at the next 2 years of finding those efficiency gains, and we are doing a lot of piloting and testing to figure out what are those best practices. We are looking at, you know, the next 2 to 5 years as when you really start to see that fully integrate into workflow models. But some early test cases that we've found really helpful is to help validate and identify areas where we need to improve our data quality. Ultimately, we want to have really good data that we use for really good client outcomes and client service. And so we've got some very smart people on the team who've been creating these tools that can help us quickly identify areas where we can improve our data much faster than the old traditional way of combing through Excel spreadsheets and doing it all manually. So that's been huge, but we're looking at all sorts of opportunities to do things more efficiently, to identify new analyses and new ways to combine those insights.
Yeah, I think that's great insight. I mean, it feels like from my perspective, and I talk to a lot of practitioners in the space, you know, sourcing deals, underwriting deals, risk analysis, those are things that are fairly light lifts for AI. And so you've seen a lot of adoption in some of those kind of first order effect of every deal starts with the same question, what's the value? And so you have a lot of these tools that can, you know, recreate DCFs or net present value calculations or BOVs and give you a sense of where the value is at a much faster pace than what you could have a human analyst do it. And I really like both of yours and Ryan's comments around the market analysis because, you know, that data has been available for a very long time. I mean, every location municipality has a chamber of commerce that puts out data. There's county records that are available. There's a bunch of transaction information across the social media channels that are now available. When every broker closes a deal, the first thing they do is tell everyone they just closed a deal. You just never could aggregate that at a scale where you could make it useful information. And now AI is helping with that. So Patrick, maybe from your perspective, you know, where are some ways that your tools or where you've seen people leveraging this to either gain efficiency, you know, from a workflow perspective or maybe even from a transaction perspective?
Yeah, and again, I'd echo what Julia and Ryan say, but I'd also just to kind of add, when you think about other data points that you can start weaving into your thesis or your investment selection or market selection. I mean, things that we looked at. I mean, we're talking to groups like Yelp and TomTom and all these different disparate data points that we can kind of weave into that are related to real estate. And as you put that mosaic together, it helps you paint a better picture of what's going to happen in terms of rents and vacancies, values. We're starting to attack construction costs and things like that, which is a very opaque marketplace. So again, I think just kind of getting outside the box and getting outside of your, no offense to Treps and the co-stars, there's other data points, there's other data providers that help provide, you know, predictive intelligence of what's going to happen inside that real estate market. And I think other groups are starting to, you know, really starting to open up to that. I assume Ryan is, I don't know if you're talking to Yelp or the TomToms, but those provide just interesting data points that, you know, provide predictability of what's going to happen in our industry.
Yeah, just to key off that, like I think that's a really important point. Not that the traditional sources of data are not useful, but what I think is really important about this moment and where we are with artificial intelligence and trying to forecast and understand the markets is we just have so many more data points that we can and data sources that we can now bring to bear on this because we have this massive compute power in a way that we didn't before. And I don't want to be excessive about this, but what I think that we're doing, or at least getting better at, is we're actually fundamentally understanding how the real estate economy works better than we have before, because we've never had the ability to pull in a lot of those resources. It's always just been, rent and vacancy and construction and net absorption and jobs and demographics and things like that. And now what we find with a lot of our models that some of the factors that are the most important for predicting a variable, it's not something that I, as an economist in an infinite number of lifetimes, would ever like ex ante select myself, but the computer can just look at all these variables and say, here are the ones that we think for this market or submarket are really the most important. And it goes back to what Patrick was saying. A lot of this data just comes from a bunch of different sources. And in infinite lifetimes, I would never have the ability myself doing, stepwise regressions or something to test all of that. But the computer is, you write the program correctly, it is single-mindedly designed to do just that. And again, it's kind of amazing. It feels like science fiction, but it's really just incredible science.
And just one more thing on top of what Ryan's saying. And we think about things in terms of just, again, space market, but what are the leading indicators? How can we think about different data points as first, second order predictors of what's going to happen? And that's kind of how we calibrate all these data points. There's a mosaic here and there's a relationship. And eventually that gets monetized in that transaction market. So I guess just going back to it and again, Ryan and I are starting to be best friends here. When we start thinking about the moat and the data quality and the engineering, it's that engineering too. And you think about these relationships and getting those first, second order effects. And then if you have that relationship, the predictability is pretty incredible.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, and Ryan mentioned this in his very first comment, but when you're trying to build a forecast that predicts something, it's amazing how the data aligns itself when you actually can analyze the data at scale, which AI now provides. So traditionally, you were looking at variables like loan to value, debt service coverage for the health of a property or performance. Now you bring in these alternative data sets. I mean, just something that we've done casually at TREP is you can actually, like in certain states like Texas, as an example, they publish alcohol sales tax receipts at restaurants. And so you can actually see which restaurants have the highest consumption of alcohol. And there's some correlation there, usually to household income and how affluent the neighborhood is, which has some downstream effects to the real estate. Same thing with Uber pickups. And all of these data providers now have APIs where you can actually start pulling all of those data points in aggregate. You can do sentiment analysis from Twitter. You can do other temperature checks on just how people view certain markets. I love the example of Yelp. When offices were really struggling, guess what was a key indicator? If there were no reviews on Yelp because people weren't going to lunch or to dinner there, it was a pretty good predictor of what the office utility was. Now, obviously, Castle Systems has like their key card reading mechanism, which before COVID, none of us would have ever thought about Castle as being a real estate data provider. And then all of a sudden, we started having the Castle Index where people were saying, what's the health of the office market based on Castle card reads? And so for all of us data nerds on this panel, we could talk about this for about 4 or 5 hours and not even scratch the surface on these alternative data sets. And if you're sitting in the audience today and you're thinking, these guys are speaking a foreign language, I have no idea what an API is, or I have no idea how Yelp correlates to real estate, you don't have to necessarily, because the reality is these models are going to start pulling this data together so that you as an end user are going to get the benefit of those outputs, even if you're not putting all of that data together. Now, with the engineering stuff that Patrick talked about, and Ryan's going to talk a little bit about this in a minute, how you construct the model is super important if it's for a purpose-built instance. But the reality is, even if you're someone that's just using a chatbot as an end user, they're starting to put together these data points on the background, and you're going to get the benefit of that. Whereas 10 years ago, you would not have had any idea about some of these alternative data sets. So one thing I wanted to switch to here a little bit is, let's just assume that underwriting and deal selection and some of these things are being influenced by AI models and by tooling. We all know that when you're trying to get a deal approved, you got to go to investment committee and there has to be some sort of formal sign off on the deal. Ryan, you're probably doing this type of work, regularly. at what point do we start, giving credit to AI when it picks, as you call, the proverbial winners instead of losers? Or when do we assign blame to the AI if the AI recommends a deal, it gets through investment committee, and then it turns out to be a dud?
Can we share that blame a little bit and credit? Because I feel like I'm almost like cybernetic at this point, but I think increasingly there's acceptance of it, but I also want to make sure that I emphasize this isn't war games, right? We're not taking humans out of the loop. I'm not trusting Joshua to start World War III against the Soviet Union or something like that. Like we are using it as a tool and an input to the process. And I will say one of the things that I like about our culture is that management is very on board with this. They're very supportive of it. But that's not to say that we don't respect the opinions of the investments team or the portfolio management team or what the asset managers have to say. So the analogy that I use, which is one that I've used for a long time, even in economics before data science was so readily available, is there's part of this that's art and there's part of this that's science. And what I'm excited about as probably the nerdiest person in this industry is that the science part of it is getting bigger and better over time. That's not to say that it's cannibalizing the art part of this. We don't want to lose that. Those things still matter. People still matter. Relationships still matter. Experience still matters. But the science part of it is just getting so much better so quickly. And that's where I'm really excited about this. So I would say it's increasingly getting credit or blame, but it's not a scapegoat either, one way or another.
Julia, Patrick, any thoughts? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just add, I look at AI and the way that we're using it today, which again, we're very excited about. It's a tool, and you have to know how the tool works. You have to be able to validate the findings of the tool. It's as if you were going to walk somebody through an analysis that you generated out of Microsoft Excel. If you don't know how the conclusions were developed, it's really hard to justify the response that you're giving to somebody. And so to your point, Ryan, it's AI enhanced human interpretation or analysis or recommendations, but we have to be really thoughtful with how we're leveraging those. And going back to my earlier comments, related to making sure that we have really good quality data. We also, one of the exciting elements of AI is being able to harness proprietary data that we have that was, previously hard to capture efficiently or with any kind of speed and efficiency. And so we've been thinking about that and using AI to get to new insights that we can then weave into new outcomes and recommendations. But again, if you don't know about the quality of the data going into that, you can't have confidence with the outputs that are coming out of it. So I think it really is, it's an enabler, but absolutely the human has to be accountable for the decisions at the end of the day.
Yeah, and again, I echo Julia and Ryan, and the analogy I always like to give is if I'm driving the football field, right? I like to say that AI can take me 80 yards, but once I get in that red zone, I want Tom Brady taking the snaps, right? I want that expert getting me into the end zone, and just because it's around the corner, we're doing some work with the Appraisal Institute, kind of the appraisal profession. Well, those individuals are held out as experts; they are licensed to do it, right? And by federal law, your valuation conclusion should be USPAP, right? Should be follow the USPAP guidelines. And I'd also kind of extrapolate that. When I think this all kind of comes back to earth, if you will, is when the lawsuits start happening, right? And you're never going to sit in front of a judge and say, "Your Honor, let me ask my chatbot." No. You're the expert. You're the one that's supposed to come up with your judgment and your expertise of why this individual is making the decision. So I think I guess my point, though, is it's always going to be the human being that's going to be the expert, and it's always going to be that individual that has the 40, 50 years of experience. That's what I'm basing my decisions on, right?
Yeah, I think you guys hit it on the head from my perspective. Like, we're in a human-driven, relationship-driven business where experience matters. AI is a tool. I think, this notion that AI is going to replace all of these different jobs and that real estate's one of them. We've seen Open Door. We've seen some of these residential online listing applications, AI-enabled tools that have failed miserably at replacing the real estate agent community. And I think the same thing is true for commercial. There are certain aspects of the job, the underwriting analysis, the due diligence, and parsing OMs that AI certainly can do at much faster pace. But you're still going to need a human that signs off on this. Like, I don't know an investment committee in the country that's going to be signing off on an AI, investment package like this. Someone has to be accountable. I do think people that leverage AI will be more successful than people that don't. But to Julia's point, it's just a tool. It's just like everything else that we've, 25 years ago when GIS was like hitting the market and you could actually like do some spatial analysis and you could do radius searches of like type properties. That was life changing. And this is just that, maybe at a multiple. So, does AI create risk or measure risk, or, how do you feel AI, calculates or brings risk into the equation, both from a user, from a company perspective? So this maybe is, to Julia's point of bad data in, bad data out. What are some guardrails or some things that people need to be, aware of from a risk perspective with AI?
I'll maybe start. I think one thing that's really important to consider is this notion of confirmation bias. If you're looking for information to support a decision, you'll go and find the information that supports that. And with AI, depending on the prompts that you're using, you could be asking for information, and AI wants to be very agreeable. It's very complimentary. It has very nice conversations with me. It's always telling me I'm right when I question it, but you have to know to question the outcomes. And so I think that's a really important element. And as I mentioned, we're all in pilot stages, and we're learning along the way with a lot of the use cases. So I think making sure that there's a sound process for using AI effectively is really important. In terms of, does it change risk profiles? I mean, I think, and you had mentioned this, Ryan, we are in a more unpredictable world these days, but I think real estate is still a longer term investment opportunity. And when you think about the fundamentals of what makes a really good investment decision, are you in the right market? Are you in the right submarket, the right neighborhood? Does it have the right foot traffic? If you're looking at restaurant demand and sales, and all of those data points are really important to consider over the long-term investment horizon.
Just jump on a few things that Julia mentioned, and just because I was at the Ares conference a couple of weeks ago, there was somebody up there pitching an academic paper that talked about how Gen AI actually, it'll curate to what objectives you're looking for, right? And there's behavioral biases in this academic. I mean, the academic proves that, right? So it's not giving you an objective outcome, which for some reason everybody thinks that that's what it's doing. It's not. It's curating based off of how you've trained your model, if you will. Some of the things that we do when we're kind of building tools, I mean, constant back testing, are we testing for seasonality? Are we testing for multicollinearity? We are very, very thoughtful when it comes to the statistics of this all. So we beat the hell out of our models, right? And we obviously are very objective about it. And some of the things that we're looking to roll out, we're getting back into the applied research setting with Johns Hopkins University and a couple other large data providers. Climate change is obviously having a dramatic impact indirectly on our business directly in the form of insurance. So we want to go out there and curate tools. The beauty of Johns Hopkins is they have a lot of resources. We're not going to bring an actuary on board, but we want an actuary as part of applied research. So when we think about these tools, we're looking at AI as advanced mathematics, right? So when we think about curating these tools, they need to be statistically sound, thoroughly back tested, and very objective. I think that's maybe the next generation of tools is getting a little bit smarter about how they curate them.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, go to your point about risk. From my perspective, I think one of the main risks that I sort of think about and I'm faced with is that there's this inverse relationship between sophistication in the models and explainability of them. And so if you could build the best models in the world, but if people don't trust them and they don't believe them, they're just going to, it's like buying the world's greatest, shiniest hammer, but then it just sits on your shelf and you just look at it, but you don't actually use it to build anything, right? Maybe you get some value out of looking at it glistening up there kind of thing, but otherwise doesn't really do a lot. And so that to me is a noteworthy risk with this, that you can make models incredibly complex, but if you can't get buy-in from people, and that's the challenge, because even as I said, even some of the most sophisticated users of this don't perfectly understand what's happening because it is so sophisticated. But that doesn't mean that it isn't incumbent upon us to really try to explain this as best we can to people. And that's where I think, that there's a lot of risk and a lot of challenge, but also a lot of reward. Can you, one of the ways that I think about my job is I'm frequently translating from geek to English for people who don't traffic in, linear matrix algebra, multivariable calculus, and Greek letters and systems of equations and that sort of thing. But at some point, you're going to need buy-in for this. The corollary to that is just sort of my general warning for people. Be very careful about using things that you don't understand. I'm not saying you have to have perfect understanding of what's going on, but there's a fundamental rule of life that says you don't know what you don't know. And to sort of the point that both Julie and Patrick were making, like sometimes you can ask like a chatbot, an LLM, to do something for you, and if it looks like it's right and it'll tell you how amazing it is, but if you don't actually understand what it's doing for you, then you won't know that it's not doing it correctly. And I've tested this, because there are fundamental differences between generalized models like LLMs and more specific purpose models like a forecasting model. Like it'll come out and tell you like, oh, you're amazing, this is the greatest thing ever. And then you ask it for the code and you look at it and you're like, well, that's not right. And that's not right. And that's not right. So I would just say, there's an inherent risk in trusting this technology too much if it's outside your domain of expertise and you don't know what it's actually doing, which goes back to a point we made before. I still think we need human experts, and I don't want to take them out of the loop. I still think human knowledge and expertise is invaluable, maybe even more valuable as we increasingly rely on this technology and expect to understand what it's doing.
Yeah, I think you can make a pretty strong argument today that you have a lot of people that are really smart at building models that are not subject matter experts in the real estate industry. And there's the missing component of, as you were saying, Ryan, translating what does it actually take to get a transaction from contract signing to closing, and what are the variables that go into that so that they can programmatically build a model that does those things. And, there's nuance where, in some form or fashion, we're all going to have to use AI at some level, whether we want to or not. So you have to accept that. And even if you're not technical, you can still significantly influence how these tools are used across our industry, because without the subject matter expertise and knowledge share, the models won't do exactly what the industry needs them to do. I mean, you guys have all said the word opaque at least a couple of times, because this is an opaque marketplace, and the people that are practicing, buying, selling, underwriting, that's where the secret sauce is. And the more you can translate that to the people building the models, the better the models will be. And so we're doing great on time. So I want to take a few minutes here and go back to some questions that we've got from the panel, from the audience. So I really appreciate you guys sending in questions, and we'll do our best to answer these. So this one's for Ryan specifically. When you're ranking markets, how are you convincing non-technical individuals that your models are worth it? How are you balancing technical expertise, leading edge machine learning techniques that are hard to explain versus the explainability to the lay public or in person or person in the company? So you kind of touched on this on the periphery, but how are you getting people comfortable with the models broadly?
Yeah, I'd say there's a couple things. The first thing is, we've been doing this for about 6 or 7 years now, so we've built up a little bit of a track record. And the more the models prove themselves that they're actually able to pick the winner markets and help you avoid the loser markets, the easier it is empirically for people to see that. I think a lot of it is just, I don't want to make it sound, I'm not trying to infantilize anybody, but there is some level of hand-holding with this, right? Because this is complicated and it's not easy. Even more traditional econometrics is not straightforward and simple for someone, as I said, who doesn't want to traffic in a lot of coding and mathematics the way some of us in this industry do. But I think the more you can demonstrate to people that it can be correct, you don't need 30 years necessarily to do that, because you could see how it unfolds over time once the model makes a recommendation about a market, and then you have a little bit of a time delay to see what happens. I would say the more of that you can show people, because at some point human beings are just like, but you got to show me, right? Like you tell me all day how amazing this model is and all this math and coding. And that's where I think the more you can actually demonstrate to people what it can do, even if that means, you have to sort of go back in time a little bit and create a model as if it were 10, 15 years ago, and it doesn't know what the world's going to do. And then you could show it what predictions it would have made relative to what actually unfolded. You just need to give people enough empirical evidence that they can feel comfortable with it, because at some point it's just going to devolve into math and coding that people don't understand if they don't traffic in this. So I'd say drown people in information, but drown people in empirical evidence as much as you can.
Yeah, I think nobody wants a black box. And I think if you can, show them the proof, then I think you get a lot more buy-in. So maybe, Julia, this next question for you: how do you harness proprietary data? Do you have in-house tools? Is there a way to use with publicly available tools?
Yes, we love our proprietary data. We've been thinking about ways to harness as much of it as possible, and we have a team that helps to build tools with the data that we're capturing. So we're looking at bidder intelligence and debt insight are two areas where, from a capital markets perspective, we're harnessing the power of our global platform to give us deeper insights into the industry. We're very excited about those. They're not publicly available tools. We use them with our clients for better client outcomes. But it's really given us a deeper level of insight. Historically, going back to we're all old timers now in the real estate industry, and you used to have to use fax machines to give people information, and old telephone calls, and I started in San Francisco. We had bike couriers, and that was kind of cutting edge back in the day. But now we've got a globally connected platform, so we can capture all of that data from around the world and do it much faster, more efficiently, and get to that real-time insight perspective, which has been really exciting.
So maybe just one more question here. I think this will be open for all of you, but what are some ways to standardize or clean up data that AI can help with? I think this is kind of table stakes at this point with AI, but maybe give us some examples of how you can standardize or clean up data at scale.
I'll maybe start. You can ask it to identify outliers. If you have, like Patrick, you were talking about rental rates. If you've got a large sample size of rental rates for New York City, and you can see what the averages are over time and in a current period, and all of a sudden you see a rent for $15 per square foot, you're going to know that's wrong. That's bad data, and it'll flag it for you. So those are some of the easy ways to look for outliers, right? There's a standard deviation that you can more quickly identify.
Yeah, I would just quickly say I like that it can help because in real estate, depending upon where you are in the world and the property type, you can be frequently dealing with something that sounds like a synonym but really isn't, like a rent. Like rent is very different in a lot of places. And so as long as you understand what rent should be versus how it's represented in a data set in a different part of the world, or even the way certain economic demographic data is accounted for and represented, as long as you get, again, I wouldn't trust it completely like ex ante, but as long as I can think through the data and give it enough guidelines or tell it exactly how to make adjustments and what I'm looking for, it can be very good at standardizing something like a rent or a vacancy, or I'm trying to pick something that's a little more sophisticated than that, like office using employment, right? There's no standard definition of office using employment. So if you're just pulling in disparate data sources and definitions of office using employment, like you will get different pools of data underlying that. It can actually help you standardize some of that so that when you do go through the process of engineering data and running models, you're using an apples to apples basis. You're not using apples to oranges to grapes to pears to bananas, something like that.
Yeah, and I just add on that again, we have clients that kind of range from large scale institutions, pension funds, endowments, but we're also talking to a lot of franchisors and folks that do site selection. So the way we kind of approach each of these folks' businesses, we just get very, very intimate with how they run their business, what empirically works, what some of the missing holes are, and we just get very intimate with the data. And obviously, I let my data scientists and my statisticians do their thing. But intimacy with the data and really diving deep into it like we own it ourselves is very, very important.
Yeah, so we had a couple questions come in around API usage and other things. It's really interesting. So, over the last 5 or so years, if you couldn't connect to data sources using an API, if you were still using SFTP or some other type of data download configuration, it was somewhat archaic. APIs were like how you had to connect data. So APIs, for maybe those that don't know, is basically just a programming interface that allows you to connect and pull data in from different connector sources. So if Julia has data, Ryan has data, and Patrick has data, and they have an API, I can just ping each of their APIs, pull data into my central repository. And now with AI, we're actually moving more towards like an MCP setup where you have model context protocol, where basically you have these agents that can set up and they can contextualize the data and run analysis at scale. There's some really interesting and powerful things. Like at TREP, we're actually about to release tomorrow our first MCP server into the marketplace. And so now you can interact with our data just through natural language, and you can connect it to external data sources, and you can analyze market level data that's not provided by TREP side by side with data that is provided by TREP in a single interface just by typing in natural language questions and getting real contextualized results real time. And, that's the future in my mind. I think the interactivity, interconnectedness of the data, everything that we've talked about today and everything you guys have just explained, it's coming to the end user at a scale that we've never seen before, where you can literally sit down in front of a machine, ask questions, and get real-time results. Now, we can argue whether they're sufficient enough or if the model's telling you the truth or if it's just being biased, whatever. All those things are true. But the way we interact with data is fundamentally changing real time. And people are going to start demanding that more and more. So the days of you having some proprietary data and thinking that that's a moat, I would contend are numbered. Like you have to be able to connect your data to other data sets that then create a bigger proprietary output than what you as a standalone can put together. So I don't know if any of you have any comments on that or thoughts. I kind of went on a soliloquy there, but I just think people are expecting to interact with data in ways today that they didn't even think were possible 5 or 10 years ago.
No, just quickly, just to connect something, Lonnie, that you said versus something that Patrick said before. That I think, the expression we use is that data engineering is our superpower. And that's how I really think about this, right? Because we have some of our own proprietary information, and then we have all of this information. We have structured data, we have unstructured data, we have data that's so unstructured, I'll just politely call it information. I think that is really what if there's any takeaway from this, I think that's really where the power of this lies. If I have to demystify this a little bit, when you can take thousands of GPUs running simultaneously in a data center, crunching more data points and variables than the human mind can reasonably comprehend, it's the stitching of that data together correctly in a way that the computer can really understand, where that like the magic happens, the thing that feels like science fiction. It sounds like you just give a computer a bunch of data and it figures it out for you. Sometimes that's right, and sometimes it's not, and you have to be careful about that. The more complex your data set is, the bigger your data set is, the messier your data set is, the more you probably still need data engineers in the loop to really think about that. But that to me is sort of where the rubber meets the road on this versus again, like the first couple decades that I spent in this industry. I'd love to build a forecast model that only uses like 40 or 50 variables, but that's why forecast models have struggled in real estate for the last 40 to 45 years, because that's not sufficient. And so I don't have enough time in infinite lifetimes to test all of these interesting data sources and variable combinations myself. But I don't need that, because now I can just get the computer to do it. So that to me is sort of the magic of all of this, that you can take all of these different data sets and information pools. If you splice them together correctly in a way that they can talk to each other and communicate, the sky's the limit with what you can actually learn about a data set or a market.
And I'll just touch it. Go ahead, Julia.
I was just going to add, I'll maybe add a different angle to this, because I get this question a lot. And the question is, what questions should I be asking right now? And it's my favorite, but it's coming up more and more because we're operating in a more complex environment. So there are new events that are taking place that we don't have a playbook for necessarily. And so often we're hearing from clients, what questions should I be asking in this scenario? And that's going to be a limitation. Now you could say, AI, tell me what questions I should be asking in this scenario, and maybe it generates some. And then the question is, what do you do with that information? It's always how do you take it, to your point, Patrick, like that last 20 yards down the field. You could have all of the information in the world. You could be asking the right questions. What do you do with it at the end of the day? And I think that's where you want to have a trusted partner. I wouldn't want to make a big decision without asking for that partnership from somebody that's a human. And I think, that's the limitation with AI. It can only get you so far in making that decision.
Yep. What I was going to add too, and awesome on the product rollout, Lonnie. I look forward to checking that out. But and again, just kind of going back to the end user. I mean, most construction folks, most developers. I mean, they're not statisticians. They're not. They don't get too deep into the math behind all this. And I think when we're developing products and rollouts, I mean, we don't want to lose that end user, right? So how do you design something that's very user friendly, that's attractive, that still captures that end user and provides them information quickly? Right. And that's something that I think as we grow into this AI renaissance, it's how do we graduate everybody, right? And some of the things that we're thinking about is we think about frequency of data, right? How do we reduce that from monthly to daily? And we think there's interactivity with that end user that actually provides us information that feeds our machine and actually makes our machine smarter. So we think about that interactivity as well. And we also think about other ways, other sectors of the industry in terms of adoption. I think the data point that I saw for the construction market, AI adoption was like 1.6%, right? There's a lot of opaqueness, but there's a lot of ways we can make that market much more efficient and smarter and price better and not build into overbuilt markets, et cetera, right? So I see that interactivity between the end user as a really important relationship. So back to like what Lonnie's, he's got this rollout. I'd be very curious to see the discussion that product had with the folks that are developing the IU or whatever that might look like. But you got to make it attractive for that end user, and you can't lose them, right? And I think that's really important as we grow.
Yeah, I think the thing that we've seen in our research is just that people are pretty much comfortable now prompting LLMs because that's been pretty much the like lowest common denominator for AI. When most people that are not super technical think about AI today, their mind immediately goes to an LLM where they're just typing in and getting a response. And so it's almost like the Google search, 20 plus years ago where people were I don't know, I used to use Ask Jeeves for a while and then it went to Google or whatever. And it's like now it's the LLM. Like everyone expects to just be able to sit down and ask a question and get a response back. And if you can build products that mimic that, then people will have a high level of adoption, with that because they're comfortable. So one thing I wanted to just kind of finish up here, I want to leave a few minutes. I know Steven's going to do a wrap at the end, so we want to be cognizant of that. But, we've talked a lot today about various levels of AI and adoption and implementation and use cases and everything else. For the audience, and maybe each of you could just take a little bit of time and kind of walk through, what would your advice be for someone that maybe is not AI native? They're intrigued by this, they're interested in it, they love hearing about what we're talking about, and they're just trying to figure out where to start. Like, do you have some advice for someone that's maybe a novice in AI but experienced in commercial real estate? Where can they start to adopt or leverage some of these tools?
It's a good question, Lonnie. I'll maybe start, and if you're at the very beginning, and we spend a lot of time talking with our clients, we do an annual tech survey to understand what are they using, how are they using it, what do they plan to use, and there's still a lot of questions around what are the right products out there, like what's going to give you the highest ROI if you're going to invest in just one thing. So I would say even exploring, like, there's a lot of cool stuff out there exploring what these different products are and what they do, and maybe even getting some demos is a great place to start, just to start to get familiar. And then also in your personal time, or when you've got some downtime in between emails and Zoom calls, play around with it and see what the capabilities are, because I think we're still in that pilot phase and really trying to figure out whatever you can that can create, an efficiency personally, and then give you an idea and inspiration to take that even further. I think AI is the only limitation of AI is the human limitation to be creative with it. That's it.
Yeah, I think that's a great response. I think Ryan would tell us that there's some limitation on power and computes, but his brain works at another level. But I agree with you. I think the human component at this point, the AI can do anything we can ask it to and beyond what we can ask it to. So maybe Patrick, Ryan, any follow-ups on where someone could start if they were interested but just not experienced?
I mean, it's just easy to go to OpenAI and just start going nuts, right? Get a Claude account, right? And just start incorporating that in your workflows and just kind of see the productivity increase week by week.
Yeah, similarly, I would say like the LLMs for whatever their fallibility are pretty amazing. So my advice is think about something, start small, right? Don't try to boil the ocean. Start with something that you have to do that's routine that you can't stand. So here's a really good example, not so much from my life now, but from a past life. When I first started on the private side of real estate, after I'd left investment banking and CMBS, and I really crossed over to the private side, I worked in asset and portfolio management. And one of the things that I had to do, which I loathe, that I still hate even when I think about, is abstracting a lease. Like, it was the most stultifying thing that I've ever done in my career. But I did it because it was part of my job. Not as sexy as building a valuation model or something like that, but I still had to do it. Take a lease that you've had to I'm just using this as an example. I'm not saying everyone abstracts lease, but if you do that, take a lease you've abstracted and then ask an LLM to do it and compare what you pulled out of it to what it pulled out of it. You might have to get used to asking it questions, training it a little bit, but those are the kinds of low-hanging fruit that the more you do that, the better it will get at it, and the more it will actually take some of that annoying rote mechanical stuff off of your plate and enable you to do something that's a little higher order. And then once you get comfortable with abstracting a lease, as just sort of my example, you can build onto something a little more sophisticated than that. But I would not necessarily try to boil the ocean up front. I would build small incrementally and get more comfortable with it, and sort of get it better adjusted to what you want it to do, and then just build on top of that. But I would definitely say start, right? Like if the thing that's holding you back is just the resistance to starting, like don't do that. Like usually in most things in life, it's just harder to start than it is to do anything else. Just try it and see what happens. Like you'll probably thank yourself that you probably wish you started sooner, actually.
Yeah, I think all three of you made some really great points on that. And I would just add, it's still in its infancy. So even though the advancements over the last couple of years are astronomical, um, it's still early enough if you're someone that hasn't tried AI to get into it. Like this hasn't been super established in the market adoption at scale. It's still early. You're not too late, but if you wait a few more years, you're going to be too late. So you need to get in while you can. And so with that, we'll close. Thank you all for the participation. I really appreciate the insights, and Stephen's going to take us out. And thank you to the attendees that carved out some time to listen to us today. We really appreciate you.
Well, Lonnie and all of our panelists, thank you so much. This is like getting a seat on the Smart Kids bus and being able to listen to the conversation. And Ryan's comment about abstracting a lease. I know a new CRE who has been working on this for, I think, like since last November. And the idea, I'm a valuation guy and I do litigation support. The concept of taking a very old and weird ground lease and teaching an LLM to understand what in the world is going on. So far, I've tried it a couple of times and experienced wonderful hallucinations. And so it's just I am so fascinated by this stuff, and I love all the input you guys had to give. It was terrific. So if you know, Ryan, of that, if you've created something you're hiding from us, we need to see it. But just think about that abstract ever being deposed by an attorney. I mean, I'd fall on my sword at that point for sure. Fascinating stuff. So for the rest of you who've joined us, watch your email for details on other upcoming webinars we've got, including a May 14th special session that's going to have Washington insider Frank Kelly, who's the founder and managing partner of the advisory firm Fulcrum Macro. I think that's going to be fascinating. Until then, on behalf of the counselors of real estate, thanks so much for attending. And we appreciate this, your involvement. Thanks for attending What's Next for Real Estate and the Life Experience. These folks are experiencing it every day. This was wonderful. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye all.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
Take care.